what to do for me. Um, the best times that I can remember as a family is when we would go over to visit Aunt Rose and Uncle Vern. They were best friends. Uncle Vern had worked with my father at Shell before he took a job with the post office as a postal carrier. Aunt Rose had been my mother's associate and would be her boss when she went back to Fry and Smith after I was grown and after I got out of the Army. So they were both best friends, and so this was a composite best friend household. Rose and Vern Dilly had no children. They only had nieces and nieces. They didn't have any nephews. So we would go over there quite often, and they would come and visit us quite often. And it was really delightful because to sit and listen to the conversation of these adults and to luxuriate in the wonderful odors of Uncle Vern's pipe or his cigars. That was wonderful. I couldn't imagine anything nicer than to go and visit the Dillys, or to have the Dillys come and visit us, or to go with the Dillys up to the cabin or someplace else like that, or to have the Dillys go with us to the ranch. My uncle Len had the family ranch in Juliet, where my mother was raised. He had built a new house for his wife and his family, but it was the same ranch, and we went there virtually every Sunday. Obviously, we didn't go to church. My father was very strange. My father believed that before the beginning of the world, God had elected 144,000 people out of all time and space to be saved.
Okay.
The rest he had preordained to be damned, by which he meant that they had been preordained to pass out of existence. And he was sure that every person born into the world was preordained to be one or the other. He knew that he was preordained to be damned. Because he drank whiskey. I never saw him drunk, but he always had his whiskey. He'd have a jigger before he went to bed. Because he smoked, and because he ate pork. And these three things made it absolutely clear that he was preordained to be damned. And his fondest hope was that his son would be of the opposite party, that he would be preordained to be saved. But he never set foot, to my knowledge, during my lifetime, he never went into a Seventh-day Adventist church. He did go into other churches for weddings and funerals, but never for worship. Never for worship. When we would be at Uncle Len's and Aunt Edna's, and the time came, out of respect for my father, my uncle or my aunt would announce that we would have a silent blessing. And at the end of that period of silence, when we were supposedly all praying, my father would announce audibly, "It's all here," by which he indicated to everyone that he had been counting the silverware.
Oh, okay.
So you can see that I have to tell you a story.
Okay.
During the Depression, which began, of course, in 1929, and my father had a good job. He was making almost $200 a month at the time when people were very often out of work, and that was good money. But in order to keep this job, he had to work 6.5 days a week. He worked Monday through Saturday, and then he went down on Sunday morning and worked at the shell yard. Sometimes I went down with him and played down there, and nice playground. But so my mother and I very often would be left at home on Sunday morning. And my mother decided, well, here's 5-year-old little Earl, and we're alone and we're abandoned, and what my husband doesn't know won't hurt him. So she decided she would take me to church. And my mother looked around and found the church that was closest to us that we could walk to. It was down on Texas Street on the other side of El Cajon. It was the Church of God of Anderson, Indiana, which is a holiness group that sprung out of Methodism in the 19th century. And they're an interesting group because they have no membership roll. Anybody who comes and attends is regarded as a member. And so, as I say, they're holiness, very close brother-sister kind of group, and undoubtedly in the early 30s, a small group, newly established. So one Sunday morning we walked down, and we were greeted on the steps. "Oh, Mrs. Langguth, welcome, welcome." And we went inside, and the service began. We sang a hymn, and at some point, that man up there in front suddenly turns and says, "Sister Langguth, would you like to lead us in prayer?" Well, now, I'm sure that this was a great honor for a newcomer, a person well experienced in the Church of God of Anderson, Indiana, to be recognized and to be invited to do this. My mother was an Episcopalian. My mother was the most outspoken, uninhibited young woman that you can possibly imagine. She was no shrinking violet. And so she stood up. "I would not," she said, and grabbed my hand. We went to the side aisle, and out we went. That ended my church experience. I think on 1 or 2 occasions in the summertime when I was up with the family in Julian, I went to the Baptist church with Uncle Ann and Aunt Edna and with my cousins David and Jack, I think. The next time I went inside a church was when Gardner Morse invited Eddie Lamping and myself to go with him to Sunday school at the Scott Memorial Baptist Church, which was about a block, maybe 2 blocks from school, right up in our own neighborhood. And I went with Gardner and with Eddie to Sunday school for I don't know how many times. My memory suggests maybe twice, maybe 3 times. I can't tell. I remember that we had books that everybody had with blanks in it, and you read the necessary verses and filled in the blanks. You know, this excuse for Christian education.
Right.
You know, and the Sunday came very quickly when the Sunday school teacher said we're going to have baptism in the church service this morning. Do any of you want to be baptized? And Gardner indicated that he wanted to be baptized. Well, if Gardner was going to be baptized, I thought I would too. And I don't remember what Eddie decided. But I dutifully went downstairs to the church telephone and called my mother and said, "I won't be home quite when you expect me. I'm going to stay for church and be baptized." "No, you are not," she said. "You will go out and stand on the curb, and in 5 minutes your father will come and pick you up." I went out and stood on the curb. In 5 minutes, my father came and picked me up. And that ended my Sunday school career. The
Okay.
next time that I can remember being in church was on obligatory day in the Order of Demolay. In Demolay, you had to go to church one Sunday a year, whether you needed to or not.
And what church do you remember going to?
The only one I can remember going to was the First Presbyterian Church in San Diego.
Okay.
And I can remember going there twice. Once on an obligatory day when someone else was master counselor, and that's where I took the chapter when I was master counselor, because it was the only church that I figured was safe. I knew that the pastor was a Freemason, and what I didn't expect was that on the Sunday that I took the chapter there, he would preach on why we should have chaplains in the public schools, which of course was very much contrary to what the Masons would have stood for and would have been promoting.
Uh-huh.
I was a bit embarrassed by that. But
Okay. One of the things that we kind of skipped over, I was thinking about what was happening before you came along. What can you tell us about World War One?
all I know about World War I is that my father, being a hospital corpsman in the Navy, was assigned to the Marines in the Expeditionary Force, and was there as a hospital corpsman in the trenches in the latter phases of the trench warfare in World War I. My father had acquired at that time a vocabulary of German. He learned to speak some German words. But since the Germans were the enemy, I know all of his words. There isn't a single one of them that I can use in polite society because they were intended to be the most terrible kind of insults. My father was firmly convinced, or he had convinced himself, that the name Langguth was not a German name. That actually it was a name that had originated in Alsace-Lorraine. It was really a French name that had gotten this German connotation to it, which was all right because one of my uncles said that we were Swiss, actually. And of course, they were both wrong. The name Langguth comes from the Black Forest region, comes from the Rhineland, and it is as German as it gets. Langguths in Germany are vintners.
Mm-hmm.
They're people who have been involved with the making of wine. And as a matter of fact, in Washington, there is a Langguth winery. I really feel I ought to search them out someday and teach them how to pronounce our name. But the Langguth winery produces wine up there in inland Washington. Someday I've got to go and visit them.
Okay. In talking about Earl C. and Kathleen Langguth, you've told me that there was seldom the time that they would show, or never show the time of intimacy.
Right.
Was there anything that they enjoyed doing together?
Besides arguing?
Besides arguing.
Well, before my dad's heart condition, he was a reasonable walker, and of course my mother loved to walk.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were on a hike up to El Capitan Dam when he had his first heart attack. And after that, he would try to go for a walk. but it was difficult for him because if it wasn't his heart, it was his colon. And before World War II, we used to hear radio programs that were beamed to us by shortwave from the BBC. And one of the songs that they used to sing over there was the thing about the Langguth walk. Every little Langguth gal with her little Langguth pal, you'll find them all doing the Langguth walk. Well, my mother would want to go for a walk, a family walk, and so we'd set out, Earl and Kathleen and little Earl, and we'd get a block or two, and suddenly my father would say, "I'm sorry, I've got to go back. I've got to go back." And my mother would sing, "Every little Langguth gal with her little Langguth pal, you'll find them all doing the Langguth walk." And we would head back so my father could go to the bathroom. I'm not entirely free from this defect myself.
So one of the things we're used to these days is that there's always some place that you can stop in and find a bathroom. There wasn't anything at the time?
Not in our neighborhood, no. See, remember, I grew up in a city.
Right.
I did not grow up in a small town. San Diego, at the time that I was born, had a population of 150,000. By the time I was ready to enter junior high school, it was 250,000. San Diego is now the second largest city in California. And it was never a small town. The difference between you and I is that if you went out and misbehaved somewhere in Dinuba, you knew that the word of it would get back to me before you did. Because everybody in town knew who you were. Mm-hmm. With me, when I was 2 blocks from home, I was anonymous. No one knew me except maybe the neighbors on either side or down the block or across the street. Any place else, I was just a faceless stranger.
But that's kind of strange because when I was in San Diego, by the time I had spent some years there, people all over San Diego knew me.
Yeah.
And out of, 1.5 million, there were probably, I could go around the neighborhood and people would identify me.
Well, there must be a difference between you. Well, of course there is a difference between us. I'm an introvert.
I'm an introvert.
Yeah, but I'm more introverted than you are.
Well...
But no, there simply were no facilities. The blocks were large and they were all residential. And you really don't go up and ring the bell and say, "I beg your pardon, but you remember I used to sell Liberty magazines to you when I was younger, and my father needs to use your bathroom." You just don't do that.
Okay. I'd like to ask you, what memories do you have of your childhood? What did you enjoy doing? Games you enjoyed playing? Favorite radio shows?
Oh, stop. Let's deal with this in order. Because I have a story. I enjoyed playing. I enjoyed imaginative games. I enjoyed magic games because I was hooked on the Oz books. Not just the Wizard of Oz, but all the books of L. Frank Baum and Ruth Plumley Thompson. They had a wonderful collection of them in Julian. I had a collection of my own. My parents read them to me until I could read them to myself. I just was really involved in them. I would select a belt, and that belt would be the magic belt. When I was about 5 or 6, my mother had an old black purse that she no longer needed. And so I got it, persuaded her to give it to me so it could be the wizard's black bag. You remember the Wizard of Oz originally was a charlatan, but after Ozma of Oz came along, Ozma and Glinda the Good and other people gave the wizard a whole kit of magic tools, magic powders and things, so that he really could work magic. And so I wanted to be the wizard and have a black bag, and my mother gave me some old samples of face powder, and I had some magical things in there. And so I had the wizard's black bag, and I was my favorite place to play was to sit on the back step and sit there in the sun and have my imaginative games and have all these things going on. And I was a very imaginative child. And so I went off to other things. My father came home, and suddenly my magic bag was gone. I couldn't imagine what I'd done with it. I looked high and low for it. I couldn't imagine where I could have put it. What happened to it? I never figured it out. For years I kept thinking, well, maybe I'll find it. I was no longer perhaps interested in playing that I was the wizard, but I was just concerned about what could possibly have happened to that black bag. Well, I know what happened to it now. My father came home and found his son playing with a woman's purse.
Mm-hmm.
And my father was really homophobic. I mean, homosexuality frightened him. One of the things that he was afraid of in my life was that I would turn out to be homosexual. When I was in college, one of my friends was a very lyric tenor and a very asexual guy by the name of Nathan Bishop. And Dad was worried silly about him because he thought that Nathan was homosexual. As far as I could ever see, Nathan was completely asexual. Sex simply did not exist for him in any form. But my father was concerned about such things. So I'm sure that he came home and saw that, and he immediately took steps to remedy this. I'm sure that I looked in the wrong place. I should have looked deep in the trash can for it. But I was imaginative. I could play with anything. I liked to play with old parts of broken clothespins. The clothespins that had the spring on them. Mm-hmm. Well, one part would break, and I'd take the other part, and that would be a motor torpedo boat. And I loved airplanes. I had some cast iron monoplanes, double cockpit monoplanes that were my favorite toys when I was 3 and 4 and 5. I had a little toy amphibian plane that unfortunately lost a wing, and it wasn't as good a toy then, and I loved playing with it in the sand. I just really enjoyed these imaginative games, and I never got over it. I would bring home in junior high, and maybe even in high school, I can't be sure, I would bring home the bottle caps from the cigar stand and sort them out. The Dr. Pepper caps, as I remember, were the Nazi divisions. Coca-Cola caps were the United States. I think Pepsi-Cola was Great Britain. And I would sit on the front steps and play Desert Warfare and move these things around. Each bottle cap was perhaps a regiment or a battalion or whatever of troops. And I would have these battles, and of course the Nazis originally won everything except one little place, but then we would invade and take it all back. And I'm very imaginative. I acquired, I won't tell you how, a rubber ball that was exceptionally live. And I would play baseball on the front steps. I would stand down in the step, that was where the pitcher's box is, and I would bounce it off the steps. And I would play whole games of baseball, playing both sides, first one and then the other. And the interesting thing about it is I didn't have any trouble at all catching flies with that. I don't know that I ever caught a fly during my entire teenage years on a baseball or softball field, but I didn't have any trouble catching that ball, which, as I think about it, puzzles me.
Okay. Favorite radio shows?
The first radio show that I can remember was a thing called Drums, starring William Farnham. This was in the early 1930s. It was William Farnham was a Broadway actor of considerable reputation. And this was a story about a family, an American family living in Egypt, who are reincarnations of ancient Egyptians. And every once in a while in their contemporary life, they experience the sound of these drums and they revert to what they were 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. I remember that because William Farnham would come on at the end and he would say, "When I say coffee, I mean Folger's coffee, black." And since he had a reputation as being something of an imbiber of alcohol, I could understand why he needed black coffee to do the radio program, but that was neither here nor there. Then my favorite radio program, of course, was Jack Benny.
Mm-hmm.
When I was growing up, I wanted to be Jack Benny. I wanted to become Jack Benny. I thought that Jack Benny was just about the ideal person. He made people laugh, but he made people laugh at him. He never ridiculed anybody else. He always was the one that was laughed at. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought he was a wonderful man. I enjoyed everything about him. And so he was my ideal. I, of course, enjoyed all of the adventure stories. I enjoyed One Man's Family, too. One Man's Family was a kind of a continuing soap opera that had a family that lived in San Francisco, and there was father and mother Barber and their children and their grandchildren and their friends. And the story just went on and on.